The small town of Maplewood was quiet, nestled between rolling hills and large oak trees. Everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slow, comfortable pace. In a small blue house on Elm Street, 12-year-old Ethan lived with his grandmother, Martha. Their home was cozy, filled with the smell of fresh cookies and the soft hum of Martha's old radio that always played jazz music in the evenings. Ethan and his grandmother shared a special bond. Martha had taken care of him since he was a little boy, and in many ways she was more than just a grandmother to him. She was his best friend. Every evening before bed, Martha would sit in the old rocking chair by Ethan's bed, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses, and tell him wonderful stories. Some nights it was a story about brave knights saving kingdoms, and on others it was about magical animals that lived deep in the forest. Ethan loved those stories. They made him feel safe and filled his mind with dreams of adventure. "One more, Grandma, please," Ethan would always beg when the story ended. Martha would smile and say, "Only if you promise to tell me your dreams in the morning." Life was peaceful, but things suddenly changed. One cold morning, Martha didn't come downstairs for breakfast. Ethan found her still in bed, her breathing slow and weak. His heart pounded as he called for help, but it was too late. A few days later, Martha passed away quietly, leaving Ethan feeling lost and alone. Without Martha, the house seemed different. It felt empty. The smell of cookies was gone, and the jazz music no longer played in the evenings. Ethan missed her more than anything. Nights were the hardest because there were no more bedtime stories. He would lie in bed, staring at the empty rocking chair, wishing she was still there to tell him just one more tale. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his room, an idea came to him. Maybe, he thought, if I write her a letter, she'll be able to read it in heaven. The thought brought him a little comfort, and so he decided to try. He pulled out a sheet of paper and grabbed a pencil. His handwriting was shaky at first, but as he wrote, the words started to flow. "Dear Grandma, I miss you so much. I wish you were here to tell me another story. I feel lonely without you. I hope you are happy in heaven. I love you. Love, Ethan." He stared at the letter for a moment, wondering what to do with it. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box he kept under his bed. It was the box where he used to keep his favorite toys, but now it would hold something much more special: his letters to Grandma. Ethan wasn't sure if the letter would ever reach her. He didn't know how letters traveled to heaven, but the act of writing to her made him feel better. It was as if, in some small way, he was still connected to her. He promised himself that he would write to her often, sharing all the little things he used to tell her when she was alive. Every few days, Ethan would sit at his desk, write another letter, and tuck it safely into the box. He would tell his grandmother about his day at school, about how he missed her stories, and how things were different without her. Weeks passed, and while the sadness of losing Martha was still there, writing the letters helped ease Ethan's pain. He liked to imagine that somewhere in the clouds, she was reading them with a smile on her face. As time went on, Ethan's letters became his way of keeping Martha close to his heart. The little box under his bed started to fill up with his words, each letter a piece of him that he shared with the woman who had meant so much to him. Even though she was gone, he felt like a part of her was still with him, listening, just like she always did. But little did Ethan know, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change everything. Ethan woke up early one Saturday morning, the sunlight filtering through the curtains of his small bedroom. The house was quiet, as it usually was these days, and he felt the familiar pang of missing his grandmother. Rubbing his eyes, he stretched and sat up in bed. That was when he remembered. Last night he had written another letter to Grandma, telling her about how much he missed her and how lonely the house had become without her. He swung his feet over the edge of the bed and walked over to his wooden box, the one that now held all his letters. He had written so many by now, each one carefully folded and placed inside the box like treasures. Opening the lid, Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. There, sitting on top of the pile of letters, was something new, something he hadn't put there. It was an envelope, plain and white, but it looked different from the paper he usually used. His heart started to race. He picked it up, his fingers trembling, as he turned it over. The handwriting on the front was familiar. It was written in neat, careful letters. To Ethan, from Grandma. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "No way," he whispered. His mind raced. He had been the only one writing letters. No one else knew about the box. Could it really be from her? His hands shook as he carefully opened the envelope and pulled out the letter inside. The paper felt soft, almost old, and the handwriting, it was unmistakably Martha's. Dear Ethan, I miss you too, my sweet boy. But don't be sad. I am always with you, watching over you from above. Remember the stories I told you? They are still with you. You are never alone. With all my love, Grandma. Ethan read the letter over and over, his mind struggling to understand what he was seeing. It couldn't be real, could it? His grandmother was gone. He had seen it happen. But here, right in front of him, was a letter. From her. From heaven? For a moment he just stood there, frozen. Then, slowly, a smile began to form on his face. He didn't care if it was impossible. Grandma had found a way to reply to him. She had heard him, even in heaven. I knew it, he whispered excitedly to himself. I knew she could hear me. He ran out of his room, letter clutched tightly in his hand, and raced over to his best friend Oliver's house. Oliver lived just down the street, and they had been friends since they were little. If anyone would believe him, it was Oliver. Panting, Ethan burst through the front door of Oliver's house, startling Oliver, who was in the middle of eating breakfast. Whoa, dude, what's going on? Oliver asked, his eyes wide as Ethan dropped the letter on the table. Look at this, Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement. Oliver picked up the letter and scanned it quickly. He raised an eyebrow. From your grandma? But how? I don't know, Ethan said, pacing back and forth. But it's her handwriting. I swear it is. And look what she says. She says she's still with me, watching over me. Oliver frowned, clearly trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But, dude, how could she write this? She's, He hesitated, not wanting to say the word. I know, Ethan interrupted. But what if she's really sending letters from heaven? What if this is some kind of, miracle? Oliver looked at him, then back at the letter. You really think that's possible? I mean, it's kind of spooky. Ethan sat down next to him, the excitement still bubbling inside. I don't know, but it has to be real. She told me in the letter that she's still watching over me. She knew I was sad and she wanted to help. Oliver scratched his head. Maybe it's magic, or maybe someone else wrote it. Ethan shook his head firmly. No way. No one else knew about the box. And no one else can write like Grandma. It's her. I know it. For a moment, the two boys sat in silence, staring at the letter. Then Oliver leaned in closer. Okay, let's say it is real. How is it happening? There has to be a way those letters are getting here. Ethan nodded. Yeah, we have to figure that out. If Grandma can send me letters, maybe there's some kind of, secret way to communicate with her. Maybe we can talk to her more. Oliver's eyes lit up. You mean like magic mail or something? Exactly, Ethan said, his mind racing with the possibilities. We have to investigate. Maybe there's a clue in the letter, or maybe someone in town knows more about this kind of thing. They both stared at the letter again, as if it held some hidden answer they hadn't yet discovered. The idea of receiving letters from heaven was thrilling, even if it was a little scary. Ethan felt a new sense of hope and excitement building inside him. For the first time since his grandmother had passed away, he felt like he wasn't alone. She was still with him, somehow, some way. And now he and Oliver had a mission. They had to figure out how these letters were coming back, and if there was a way to send more. For the next few weeks, Ethan's routine remained the same. Every few nights, he would sit at his desk, pull out a sheet of paper, and write another letter to his grandmother. In each one, he shared the little details of his day, how school was going, the weather, how he still missed her stories. And each time, he carefully folded the letter, placed it in the box under his bed, and waited. The replies kept coming. Every few days, a new letter would appear in the box. Just like the first, they were written in what seemed to be Martha's neat, careful handwriting. The letters were warm and comforting, always filled with kind words telling Ethan to stay strong, to remember that she was watching over him. But something started to feel different. At first, Ethan couldn't put his finger on it. The words still brought him comfort, and the handwriting was unmistakably familiar. But there were small details, tiny, almost unnoticeable things, that started to make him wonder. One letter talked about a book Ethan hadn't read yet, one that his grandmother had never mentioned to him before. Another spoke about an event in the town that happened after she had passed away. And one letter even referred to his school friend Oliver by name, which struck Ethan as odd. He had never mentioned Oliver in his letters. How could his grandmother know about him? The more Ethan thought about it, the more confused he became. He didn't want to doubt the letters. He didn't want to believe they were anything other than what he hoped. But the small inconsistencies nagged at him, making him question whether the replies were truly coming from his grandmother in heaven. One afternoon, Ethan brought his concerns to Oliver. They sat together on the swings in the park, their feet dragging in the dirt as they slowly swayed back and forth. "I don't get it, Oliver," Ethan said, his brow furrowed. "At first, I thought it was definitely Grandma. The handwriting, the words, everything seemed perfect. But now I'm not so sure." Oliver kicked at the dirt beneath his swing, thinking, "You mean because of the stuff in the letters? Like, how does she know about things that happened after she, you know?" "Yeah," Ethan nodded. "And there's other stuff too. She mentions people and places that she never talked about when she was alive. It's like whoever is writing these letters knows things they shouldn't." Oliver rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "You think maybe someone else is writing them? Someone who knew your grandma?" Ethan frowned. "Maybe, but who? And why? I haven't told anyone else about the letters." Oliver stopped swinging and stood up. "Well, if there's something weird going on, we need to find out who's behind it. What if we start asking around?" Ethan looked up, a little hesitant. "Ask who? No one's going to believe us if we just walk up to them and say, 'We're getting letters from heaven.'" Oliver grinned. "We don't have to tell them everything. We just need to see if anyone knew your grandma well enough to write letters like this. Maybe someone in the neighborhood, or even the mailman. If they've been watching you, they might have seen something." It sounded like a good idea, and Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could figure this out after all. The next day, the boys set off on their mission to find answers. They started with the most obvious place, the mailman. His name was Mr. Higgins, a friendly older man who had been delivering mail in Maplewood for as long as anyone could remember. Ethan had seen him almost every day as he passed by the house, but he never thought to ask him anything. Until now. The boys waited for Mr. Higgins by the mailbox, and when he finally arrived in his blue uniform, they approached him. "Hi, Mr. Higgins," Ethan said, trying to sound casual. "Can we ask you something?" Mr. Higgins smiled down at them, his large mustache twitching as he spoke. "Well, sure, Ethan. What can I do for you boys? Have you, noticed anything strange about the letters coming to my house?" Ethan asked, choosing his words carefully. "Like maybe someone's been sending me letters without me knowing?" Mr. Higgins scratched his head. "Strange? Not that I can think of. Your house doesn't get much mail these days, aside from the usual stuff. You expecting something special?" Ethan glanced at Oliver, then shook his head. "No, just curious. Thanks, Mr. Higgins." They walked away feeling no closer to the truth. Next, they visited Mrs. Thompson, who owned the corner shop down the street. She had known Ethan's grandmother well. Martha used to buy groceries from her every week. When they asked her if she had heard of anything unusual, Mrs. Thompson just smiled kindly and said, "Your grandma was a special lady, Ethan, but no, I haven't seen or heard anything strange." Their search seemed like it was leading nowhere. But as they were heading back home, Ethan noticed someone sitting on a bench near the park. It was Mr. Wilson, an old man who lived alone in a small house at the end of their street. He had always been a quiet, mysterious figure in the neighborhood. Ethan didn't know much about him, except that he used to be good friends with Martha. "Maybe we should talk to him," Oliver suggested. Ethan hesitated, but something told him that Mr. Wilson might know more than he let on. They approached the old man cautiously. "Hi, Mr. Wilson," Ethan said, trying to sound polite. "Can we ask you something?" Mr. Wilson looked up from his book, his gray eyes sharp and alert despite his age. "What is it, boys?" "We've been, getting some letters," Ethan began slowly, "and we were wondering if you knew anything about them." Mr. Wilson raised an eyebrow, his gaze locking onto Ethan's. "Letters? From your grandmother, I assume?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? He hadn't told anyone except Oliver. Mr. Wilson smiled faintly. "Your grandmother and I were very close, Ethan. She told me many things before she passed. Perhaps there's more to those letters than you think." There was something in Mr. Wilson's voice, Something that made Ethan feel like he wasn't telling them everything. Could he be the one behind the letters? And if so, why? Ethan exchanged a glance with Oliver. They were getting closer to the truth, but it seemed like Mr. Wilson had secrets of his own. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Wilson knew more than he was letting on. For days, it was all he could think about. Every time he passed by Mr. Wilson's house, a quiet little cottage covered in ivy, he felt a mix of curiosity and frustration. Why hadn't Mr. Wilson told them more? What was he hiding? Oliver, always the more adventurous of the two, suggested they visit Mr. Wilson again. "We have to ask him directly," Oliver said one afternoon while they sat in Ethan's room. "He knows something, and I bet he's the one behind the letters." Ethan wasn't so sure. Part of him didn't want to know the truth. What if it wasn't his grandmother sending the letters? What if everything he had believed, the hope, the comfort, was just an illusion? But Oliver was right. They needed answers. The next morning, Ethan and Oliver stood outside Mr. Wilson's gate, the cool autumn air swirling around them. The house looked quiet, as always, with no sign of Mr. Wilson in the yard. With a deep breath, Ethan opened the gate, and they walked up the narrow path to the front door. Ethan knocked, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Wilson, wearing a sweater that looked far too big for his thin frame. His gray eyes studied the boys, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Well now," he said, stepping aside to let them in, "I was wondering when you two might come back." Ethan and Oliver exchanged a quick glance before stepping inside. Mr. Wilson's house was small but cozy, filled with old books, wooden furniture, and the faint smell of lavender. There was something comforting about it, much like Martha's house had been. They followed Mr. Wilson into the living room, where he motioned for them to sit down on a large worn sofa. He took a seat in an armchair across from them, folding his hands in his lap. "So," Mr. Wilson began, his eyes twinkling slightly, "what can I do for you boys?" Ethan cleared his throat, his voice a little shaky. We think you know something about the letters I've been getting, the ones from my grandmother." Mr. Wilson didn't seem surprised. In fact, he nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this conversation. "Ah, the letters," he said softly. "Yes, I know about them." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "You do? So it was you?" For a moment, Mr. Wilson was silent, his gaze steady on Ethan. Then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, Ethan. It was me who's been writing those letters." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Ethan felt a swirl of emotions rush through him. Confusion, anger, sadness. He had suspected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. The letters weren't from heaven. They weren't from his grandmother. "But why?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do that?" Mr. Wilson's expression softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw a deep kindness in his eyes. "Your grandmother asked me to," he said gently. "Before she passed, she came to me with a request. She knew how much you loved her, how close the two of you were. She didn't want you to feel alone after she was gone. So she asked me to write to you, to give you the feeling that she was still with you, even after she was no longer here." Ethan stared at Mr. Wilson, trying to process what he was hearing. "She asked you to write letters? Pretending to be her?" "Not pretending, Ethan," Mr. Wilson corrected softly. "She wanted to give you comfort, to help you through your grief. She knew you would miss her terribly, and she believed that if you thought she was still watching over you, it would ease your sadness." Ethan's mind raced. It made sense now. The letters mentioning things his grandmother couldn't have known, the subtle hints that someone else was behind them. But it didn't make the truth any easier to accept. "She cared about you deeply," Mr. Wilson continued. "She didn't want you to feel lost or alone. The letters were her way of helping you hold on to the love you shared." For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. His throat tightened and he felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He didn't know what to feel. A part of him was angry. Angry that the letters hadn't been real, that he had believed in something impossible. But another part of him felt something different. Gratitude. His grandmother had loved him so much that she had thought of him even in her final days, planning a way to make sure he didn't feel abandoned. The letters weren't a trick. They were a gift, a final act of love. "I'm sorry if this has hurt you," Mr. Wilson said quietly, "but I promised your grandmother I would take care of you, in the small way that I could." Ethan wiped his eyes, his emotions a tangled mess. "I don't know what to say. I'm sad, but I'm also grateful. It was nice, thinking she was still here." Mr. Wilson smiled kindly. "She is still here, Ethan. Not in the way you hoped, but in your heart, in your memories. She'll always be with you." Ethan nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. It was a lot to take in, but somehow, knowing the truth didn't hurt as much as he thought it would. The letters had brought him comfort when he needed it most. And even though they hadn't come from heaven, they had come from a place of love. Oliver, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "So what now? Are you going to keep writing letters?" Mr. Wilson shook his head gently. "No, I think it's time for the letters to end. Your grandmother wanted them to help you through the hardest part, and I believe you're strong enough now to carry her love with you on your own." Ethan looked at Mr. Wilson, and for the first time he felt a deep sense of peace. His grandmother may have been gone, but she had found a way to stay with him in the most important way, through love, care, and the memories they shared. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you for helping me." Mr. Wilson smiled softly. "It was my honor, Ethan. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, and she loved you more than anything." As Ethan and Oliver left Mr. Wilson's house that day, Ethan felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted from his heart. The truth wasn't what he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed. The letters may have ended, but his grandmother's love would never fade. And that, Ethan realized, was more than enough. The crisp autumn breeze rustled through the golden leaves as Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. The sun was setting outside his window, casting a warm orange glow across his room. In front of him, the wooden box sat quietly, filled with all the letters he had written to his grandmother over the past few months. This would be his last one. Ethan took a deep breath, his pencil hovering over the paper. Writing these letters had become a way for him to stay connected to his grandmother, to feel her presence even though she was gone. But now, after everything that had happened, after discovering the truth from Mr. Wilson, he knew it was time to say goodbye, at least in this way. Slowly he began to write. "Dear Grandma, I'm writing you one last letter to thank you. Thank you for all the stories you told me, for all the love you gave me. I've missed you so much, but I understand now that you've never really left. You're still with me, in every memory and in every kind thought I have. I also want to thank Mr. Wilson. I know you asked him to help me, and he did. He made sure I didn't feel so alone, and I think you knew that was what I needed. I'm sad that the letters weren't really from you, but I'm also grateful. You cared about me so much that you found a way to help me, even after you were gone. I think I'm ready to move on now. I know you're watching over me, and I don't need letters to remind me of that. I'll always keep you in my heart, Grandma. I'll never forget the stories, the laughs, and the love. I'm going to be okay. Love always, Ethan." He sat back and read the letter, feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was a deep sadness in knowing this chapter of his life was ending, but there was also a sense of peace, of closure. Ethan carefully folded the letter and placed it in the box with the others. He closed the lid, feeling like he had taken an important step forward. The next day, Ethan decided to visit Mr. Wilson. Over the past few weeks, they had grown closer. Mr. Wilson had become a quiet, steady presence in Ethan's life, filling some of the void that his grandmother had left behind. Though he could never replace Martha, there was comfort in having someone who understood their bond. When Ethan arrived at Mr. Wilson's house, the old man was sitting on his porch, reading a thick, worn-out book. He looked up as Ethan approached, a small smile appearing on his face. "Hello, Ethan," he said warmly. "Good to see you, my boy." Ethan smiled back and sat down beside him. For a moment, they didn't say anything. They simply enjoyed the crisp autumn air and the soft rustle of leaves around them. "I wrote my last letter to Grandma yesterday," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. He looked down at his hands, feeling a little unsure. "I told her I'm ready to move on." Mr. Wilson nodded slowly, his eyes kind. "That's a big step, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan felt a weight lift off his shoulders at those words. He had been worried about what moving on might feel like, as if it meant letting go of his grandmother completely. But now, sitting here with Mr. Wilson, he realized that wasn't true. He didn't have to let go of her at all. He just had to carry her in a different way. "I think she's still with me," Ethan said, his voice quiet but confident. "Not through the letters, but in everything she taught me. In the stories, in the way she always made me feel loved. I don't need magic to keep her close." Mr. Wilson smiled, a look of pride in his eyes. "That's right, Ethan. Love doesn't need magic. It's in the people we remember, in the kindness we share, and in the memories that stay with us. Your grandmother's love will always be a part of you, no matter what." Ethan felt the truth of those words settle in his heart. His grandmother's love was still with him in every small moment, every fond memory, and every story he carried forward. It was a part of who he was, and it always would be. Over the following months, Ethan and Mr. Wilson became close friends. Mr. Wilson would often invite Ethan over to talk, share stories about his own life, and sometimes they would sit together in the evenings, much like Ethan used to do with his grandmother. They talked about everything: school, the changing seasons, and even old stories from Mr. Wilson's youth. Ethan found comfort in these conversations. In many ways, they reminded him of the bond he shared with his grandmother. Though their relationship was different, it was built on the same foundation of care and understanding. Mr. Wilson became someone Ethan could rely on, a steady presence in his life. One cold winter evening, as they sat together by the fireplace in Mr. Wilson's living room, Ethan realized something. His grandmother's love had not just stayed with him, it had brought new people into his life. People like Mr. Wilson, who now felt like a part of his extended family. Ethan smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. He had learned something important through all of this. Love didn't end when someone left. It continued on, shaping the way he saw the world and the people around him. And in that way, his grandmother's love had given him more than just letters. It had given him the strength to find new connections, to open his heart to others, and to carry forward the lessons she had taught him. One snowy morning, Ethan stood by his grandmother's grave, the box of letters in his hands. He had come to visit her, as he often did, but this time was different. He didn't feel the same ache of sadness that had once filled him. Instead, he felt at peace. "Hi, Grandma," he said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." He opened the box and placed it gently at the base of the headstone. "I'm ready to move forward now, but I'll always keep you in my heart. I know you're still with me, and I'll always remember the love you gave me." As he stood there, a light breeze stirred the trees around him, and for a moment, Ethan felt like his grandmother was right there watching over him. He smiled, knowing that she would always be a part of him, no matter where life took him. And with that, Ethan turned and walked away, ready for the new beginning that awaited him, with his grandmother's love forever in his heart.